Ethan Walker was an ordinary young man living in Chicago, but inside him was a storm of doubts, fears, and an endless desire to please people. He had grown up believing that if he worked hard enough to make everyone happy, then maybe, just maybe, he would finally feel accepted. But life kept proving him wrong. No matter how much effort he put into being the perfect son, the perfect friend, or the perfect employee, there was always someone who criticized him, misunderstood him, or left him behind. One cold evening, after a long exhausting day at work, Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, scrolling aimlessly through his phone. His boss had dismissed his ideas again, his friends had gone out without even inviting him, and his family barely noticed how much he was struggling. That night, he felt invisible. He felt like his entire existence was nothing more than a shadow in the background of other people's lives. And then, almost by accident, his thumb stopped on a video. It was Mel Robbins, speaking with that calm yet powerful tone that felt like she was talking directly to him. She said something so simple, yet so piercing, that Ethan's world tilted on its axis. If people don't support you, let them. If people don't respect you, let them. If people talk behind your back, let them. You cannot control them, but you can control yourself. Ethan froze. He replayed the clip again. And again. It was as if someone had finally given him permission to stop running, to stop chasing, to stop bleeding himself dry for people who didn't even notice. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. The words echoed in his mind all night. Let them, let them, let them. The next morning, when his phone buzzed with a group chat notification from his so-called friends, pictures of them laughing at a dinner he wasn't invited to, his heart stung. But instead of feeling desperate, instead of typing, "Why didn't you call me?" Ethan whispered to himself, "Let them." It was the beginning of a shift so small no one else could see it, but inside him, it was monumental. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan kept testing this strange new mindset. When his boss ignored his proposal during a meeting, he didn't stew in silence like before. He simply said what he needed to say, and when no one listened, let them. Because he knew his worth wasn't defined by that one moment. Slowly, Ethan started reclaiming pieces of himself he had buried long ago. He began writing again, a passion he had abandoned because someone once told him it was a waste of time. He joined a local gym, not because others expected him to look a certain way, but because it made him feel alive. He stopped apologizing for saying no. He stopped begging people to stay. And something strange happened. When Ethan stopped chasing people, the right people started finding him. At a coffee shop one afternoon, while scribbling notes about his thoughts on the let them theory, a stranger noticed his notebook. "Are you writing a speech?" she asked with curiosity. Ethan chuckled and said, "No, just trying to figure out how to live my life better." The stranger smiled and replied, "Sounds like you're on the right track." That single conversation planted a seed. For the first time in his life, Ethan wondered if maybe his pain and his journey could inspire someone else. Maybe he wasn't just a shadow after all. And as he walked home that evening, he realized something. The let them theory wasn't just a phrase anymore, it was becoming the foundation of who he was becoming. Ethan didn't know it at the time, but those two little words, let them, were quietly transforming his entire existence. At first, it felt unnatural. After all, for 28 years of his life, he had trained himself to jump, to explain, to beg for acceptance whenever someone rejected him. Letting people walk away without resistance felt almost like giving up. But slowly, he began to realize that it wasn't surrender, it was freedom. One evening, his childhood friend Mason called him out of nowhere. They hadn't spoken in months. Mason immediately started criticizing Ethan for not showing up at gatherings, for being too quiet, and for changing too much. The old Ethan would have apologized endlessly, tried to justify, and maybe even forced himself to attend the next party just to keep the friendship alive. But that night, Ethan just listened, and when Mason's words grew sharp, Ethan calmly said, "If that's how you feel, that's okay." And when Mason hung up on him with anger, Ethan whispered softly into the empty room, "Let him." It was like unclenching a fist he didn't even know he had been holding for years. For once, he wasn't carrying someone else's disappointment on his back. He just let it fall. Days after that moment, Ethan noticed how light he felt. His shoulders weren't so tense. His nights weren't so restless. It was as if he had opened a door inside himself that led to quiet, steady peace. And with that peace came clarity. He began to notice how much time he had wasted in his life chasing validation, trying to prove his worth to people who had already decided not to see it. One Saturday morning, Ethan sat by his window with a notebook. He began writing, not about goals or tasks, but about truths he had discovered. He wrote down lines like, "If they doubt you, let them. If they leave you, let them. You don't need their permission to live." Those notes weren't just words. They were reminders, anchors, and slowly they became his armor. Whenever life threw its usual rejection at him, he didn't crumble. He leaned on his notes, on the let them theory, on the voice of Mel Robbins that still echoed in his head. As weeks passed, something inside Ethan grew stronger. His silence wasn't weakness anymore, it was choice. His no wasn't rebellion, it was self-respect. And most of all, he began to understand a profound truth. People are always going to have their opinions, judgments, and reactions. But he wasn't responsible for managing them. He was responsible for managing himself. One night, while watching another Mel Robbins video, Ethan felt a rush of gratitude. He realized he wasn't just a fan anymore. He was a believer. He wasn't following a motivational trend, he was living it. And in that moment, he made a quiet promise. He would not just practice the let them theory, he would promote it, share it, breathe it, until people around him could see what real freedom looked like. That promise soon turned into action. It began small. Ethan posted short reflections on social media, nothing fancy, just his thoughts in raw, honest words. If people misunderstand you, let them. Your truth doesn't need defending. At first, only a handful of people liked or commented. But to Ethan's surprise, a few strangers reached out privately. They said things like, "I really needed this today," or, "Thank you, I thought I was the only one feeling this way." For the first time, Ethan saw how his personal struggle could become someone else's survival guide. And with every message, his resolve grew. At work, his coworkers noticed a change in him. He wasn't the people pleaser anymore. He wasn't shrinking back or over-explaining. He spoke when he had something to say, and if no one agreed, he let them. He worked with quiet confidence, and to everyone's shock, his boss, who had always overlooked him, started asking for his input. By letting go of the need to be noticed, Ethan had ironically become impossible to ignore. It was almost poetic. The very thing he stopped chasing was the thing that started chasing him. But the real test came one evening when Ethan's family confronted him at dinner. His mother told him he was selfish for not bending over backward anymore to solve everyone's problems. His uncle mocked him for listening to internet nonsense. In the past, their disapproval would have shattered him. But this time, Ethan simply looked at them, nodded, and ate his food in silence. Inside, his heart whispered the words that had become his shield, "Let them." That night, walking home under the streetlights, Ethan smiled to himself. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He just felt free. For the first time, he belonged to himself. And that was only the beginning. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan realized that the let them theory was not just a practice, it was becoming a philosophy of life. Every time he chose to let someone go, every time he resisted the urge to chase, something inside him grew stronger. It was like training a muscle he never knew he had. And with each repetition, he was no longer the man who used to beg for scraps of attention. He was someone else, someone freer, someone truer. One cold Sunday morning, Ethan received a text from his ex-girlfriend, Lily. She wrote, "I see you've changed. You think you're better now. You'll always be the same insecure guy." The old Ethan would have fallen apart reading those words. He would have written long paragraphs defending himself, proving how much he had changed, trying to get her approval one last time. But this new Ethan read the message slowly, breathed deeply, and then, he smiled. He didn't reply. He whispered gently, "Let her." It was like a final test. For years, Lily's opinion had defined his self-worth. But now, he had taken back the power. Her words didn't chain him anymore, they bounced off him like drops of rain on a shield. He was free in a way that no breakup, no argument, no closure had ever given him. He had given it to himself. That night, Ethan sat down and wrote in his notebook again, "Your peace is not up for negotiation. If they mock you, let them. If they misjudge you, let them. If they leave you, let them. Freedom begins when you stop fighting battles that don't matter. He decided to share that exact page on his social media. The post went viral, not millions of views, but thousands, enough to shock him. Strangers from across the world commented things like, "This is exactly what I needed today," and, "How do you know what I'm going through?" Ethan felt humbled. He wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't a coach. He was just a man living honestly, and yet his words were touching people he had never met. Slowly, his inbox began filling with stories. A young woman from Canada told him she was stuck in a toxic friendship, but after reading his post, she whispered, "Let them," and walked away. A middle-aged father from India said he always struggled to win his family's respect, but now he realized he didn't need to perform for their approval anymore. Ethan read these messages with tears in his eyes. He had always thought he was invisible, but now his pain had become a beacon for others. One evening, while scrolling through his feed, Ethan saw a short clip of Mel Robbins herself explaining the "let them" theory on stage. The crowd was roaring with applause. Ethan leaned back in his chair and whispered, "This is it. This is the movement. And I'm not just a fan, I'm part of it." That night, he made a decision. He would dedicate his voice, his energy, his story, to spreading this message as far as it could go. Not because he wanted fame, not because he wanted recognition, but because he knew there were millions of Ethans out there, people silently begging for permission to stop chasing, to stop apologizing, to finally breathe. So he began recording videos. His setup was simple, just his phone in a quiet corner of his apartment. He spoke directly, softly, honestly. He told people about the night his best friend walked away. He told them about Lily's harsh words. He told them about the family dinner where he chose silence over argument. Every story ended the same way, with those two words that had changed everything: "Let them." At first, only a few people watched. But then, something unexpected happened. One of his videos was shared in a self-growth community online, and overnight, it exploded with thousands of views. Comments poured in. "Who is this guy? This story saved me tonight. I finally left my toxic job because of this." Ethan was stunned. For years, he had been the invisible one, the background character in other people's lives. Now, he was becoming a guide, a voice, maybe even a leader. And all of it happened not because he forced people to listen, but because he stopped forcing anything at all. Irony had written his story. The moment he stopped begging for validation was the moment the world leaned closer to hear his truth. Late one night, as he watched the numbers climb on his latest post, Ethan closed his laptop and sat in silence. He whispered to himself, "I used to think I had to run after people to matter. But the let them theory has shown me, when you stop chasing, the right ones find you." He smiled, leaned back, and felt a peace deeper than anything he had ever known. For the first time in his life, Ethan Walker wasn't just surviving, he was living. And this was only the beginning of his voice reaching the world. The more Ethan shared, the more people connected. His inbox was no longer just a trickle, it was a flood. Teenagers wrote to him about feeling invisible in school. Young professionals confessed they were stuck in careers chosen by their parents, terrified to walk away. Even older men and women, people twice his age, told him they had lived their entire lives chasing approval that never came. Ethan would sit for hours, reading these stories, his heart heavy but alive. He realized something profound. People weren't broken, they were just trapped in patterns of begging, explaining, and proving. The same prison he had once lived in. And the key, he now knew, was unbelievably simple: let them. One night, he was invited to speak on a small online panel about personal growth. At first, Ethan almost said no. The old fear crept in: what if I stutter? What if I don't sound smart enough? What if no one cares? But then he remembered Mel's words: "You don't have to be fearless. You just have to take action." He whispered to himself, 5 seconds, counted down, and pressed yes on the invitation. The day of the event, Ethan sat nervously in front of his laptop. The host introduced him as a storyteller whose posts have touched thousands. Ethan almost laughed. He wasn't a professional speaker. He wasn't polished. He wasn't trained. But when it was his turn to talk, something shifted. He didn't deliver a speech, he simply told the truth. He told the story of the night his best friend left. He told them about Lily's cruel text. He told them how he had always chased love, approval, and respect, and how it had left him empty. And then, with quiet conviction, he said, "The moment I stopped chasing, I became free." The let them theory isn't about letting people win, it's about letting yourself live. The screen was silent. Ethan panicked for a moment, thinking he had failed. But then, one by one, the little chat messages started popping up. "Wow, this hit me hard. I've never heard it explained this way. I needed this today." Tears welled in Ethan's eyes as he realized, he wasn't just talking. He was reaching. After that event, invitations began trickling in, small podcasts, Instagram lives, community groups. Ethan said yes to as many as he could. Each time, he spoke not like a guru, not like a polished coach, but like a friend who had been through the fire and survived. People didn't just hear him, they felt him. Slowly, his life transformed. The same man who once sat alone in his apartment feeling forgotten was now becoming a voice of comfort for thousands. But the most beautiful change wasn't in the numbers, it was in Ethan himself. He no longer panicked when someone ignored him. He no longer begged for friendships to return. He no longer explained himself endlessly to people who had already judged him. Instead, he lived lighter. He laughed louder. He even started noticing how much beauty there was in everyday life. Sunlight spilling through his window in the morning, the sound of children playing outside, the taste of coffee warming his hands. For the first time in years, Ethan was present. But life, as always, tested him again. One evening, at a family dinner, his uncle made a sarcastic comment in front of everyone. "Oh, look at Ethan, pretending to be some kind of internet philosopher now. You think people really care what you have to say?" The whole table laughed politely, waiting for Ethan's reaction. The old Ethan would have flushed red, rushed to defend himself, tried to prove his worth. But this Ethan simply took a sip of water, smiled softly, and said nothing. Inside, he whispered, "Let them." The silence stretched. His uncle looked unsettled, like he expected a fight but didn't get one. Ethan's calmness was louder than any argument. For the first time, his family saw him not as the boy who always tried too hard, but as a man who no longer needed their approval to breathe. That night, Ethan realized the let them theory had moved beyond being a practice. It had become his identity. It wasn't something he did anymore, it was who he was. And in that realization, he felt unstoppable. Not in an arrogant way, but in a deeply grounded way. He no longer needed everyone to like him. He no longer needed the past to change. He no longer needed permission to exist. He was finally enough, exactly as he was. He opened his notebook one last time that night and wrote, "You don't lose people when you let them go. You lose chains. You lose cages. You lose the weight that was never yours to carry." Ethan closed the notebook, leaned back, and smiled. Somewhere deep inside, he knew this was only the beginning. He had found his voice, his freedom, and his calling. And now, nothing and no one could take that away. Months passed, and Ethan's life began to resemble something he had once only dreamed of. He was still the same man, living in the same apartment, walking the same streets, but everything inside him was different. The weight he had carried for so long was gone. Where there used to be desperation, there was peace. Where there used to be noise, there was clarity. One evening, as he scrolled through his messages, he saw an email that made him freeze. It was from the Mel Robbins team. They had noticed his writings, his talks, and the way he had been sharing the let them theory with such honesty. They invited him to join a live online event as a guest speaker, to share his personal story of transformation. Ethan's hands trembled. This was beyond anything he had imagined. The night of the event, Ethan sat in front of his computer, staring at the screen as hundreds of participants filled the virtual room. Then, Mel Robbins herself appeared, smiling warmly as she introduced him. "Tonight, we're joined by someone who has lived the let them theory, not just understood it. Please welcome Ethan Walker." For a moment, Ethan's throat closed. He remembered the boy who had once begged for attention, the young man who had been abandoned, the friend who had been mocked at family dinners. He remembered the countless nights of loneliness, the moments of doubt, the tears nobody saw. And then he remembered the choice, the simple, quiet choice, to let them. He took a deep breath and began. "I used to think my worth depended on who stayed in my life. I thought if someone walked away, it meant I wasn't enough. I chased people, begged them, explained myself over and over. But then I discovered something that set me free. If people want to leave, let them. If people don't believe in you, let them. If people laugh, let them. Because the moment you stop chasing what's not yours, you start receiving what is. And what's yours will never need convincing, it will stay. The chat window exploded with comments. People were crying, clapping through their keyboards, writing messages like, "This hit my soul," and, "Thank you for saying what I couldn't put into words." Ethan didn't feel like a star. He didn't feel like a guru. He felt like a man who had once been lost and had finally found himself, and now he was simply lighting the path for others. When the event ended, Mel looked at him and said, "Ethan, you're proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they live with courage. Your story matters. And tonight, you've given permission for thousands of others to let go and breathe again." Ethan muted his mic, leaned back in his chair, and let the tears fall freely. Not because he was sad, but because he was grateful. For the first time in his life, he realized he no longer needed to prove anything. He didn't need to chase. He didn't need to beg. He didn't need to explain. He whispered to himself, almost like a prayer, "I am enough. And I always was." The screen faded to black, but the fire inside him burned brighter than ever. The boy who once thought his world had ended had just begun his true life. And his message would echo far beyond him, reminding anyone who felt invisible, broken, or abandoned that freedom is just one choice away. Let them doubt. Let them laugh. Let them go. Because when you stop fighting for what's not meant for you, you finally start living for what is. And Ethan Walker, once just another fan of Mel Robbins, had now become a living example of her most powerful truth.